So as Chef said, he's from the North Island of Hokkaido, which is kind of like the Alaska of Japan, and it's much more sparsely populated than the regular island. And kind of the western view of Japan is this sprawling metropolis, where actually north of the island it's much more outdoors, much more kind of what we would think of like Canada, Alaska would be much sparsely populated, much different food and just culture of people. So the chef is from Hokkaido, and I lived in Hokkaido for 2 years, which is not normally the place where foreigners go, and lived in a very, very small village there, cooking for 2 years, both for Mishobra and for a variety of different Japanese restaurants, kaiseki and noodle and sushi and so. But the style of cooking in Hokkaido is what they call, oftentimes it's called inaka style. And you can have inaka style cooking all over Japan. And inaka means kind of countryside, country cooking. And so that it's more kind of country people, not the fast-paced Tokyo or Osaka. It's much more laid back, rustic countryside style of cooking and eating and culture. And so I wanted to do, since Chef and I got paired up together as two Hokkaido people, and a lot of people from Hokkaido never really leave that area. It's very similar to kind of small town life in the U.S. So I wanted to do a dish and talk a little bit about Japanese noodles and the kind of more countryside context. Because I think in this country we generally look at Japanese cooking as being this very refined and more kind of fine dining driven food, because that's what's become popular. And as I was saying at the beginning, we've had this kind of mishmash of Japanese cooking. We've got Japanese restaurants where it's everything under one roof, and that's what we've kind of become accustomed to in the US. But it's very much different disciplines. You go to one place for one item or one type of dish or one type of cuisine. And again, as I wanted to bring it, draw the chef this type of, there's a lot of regional differences. And the Japanese people will talk about Tokyo and Osaka as like they're two different worlds, but it's like a 2-hour train ride apart from these two places. So very close, or Kansai region, which is Osaka, but outside of Osaka, Kyoto, Nara, and Kobe, and the Kansai region, the Tokyo cuisine, places that are geographically very close, have very different cooking styles. And generally, there's large spans of space in between cooking styles and diversity in other countries, where, as in Japan, things are very, very close to each other, but things are very different. So I wanted to kind of cook something that was very much the countryside, Hokkaido inspired dish. But since I'm not actually a Japanese chef, I wanted to play a little bit on another kind of countryside cooking dish that's got its equivalence of this type of Japanese cooking, which is the French pot au feu. So taking both the Japanese background and the French background and combining that together into one dish, which is going to be a kind of Japanese version of the pot au feu. Just give me 1 second to get set up here. So we're talking about casual cuisine here, but I wanted to kind of bring in some kind of interesting new modernist type of techniques in the preparation of what's actually a relatively simple and straightforward dish today. So I'm going to do udon noodle dish and cook the udon noodles traditionally, but I'm going to combine that with a slightly more kind of modernist version of this hybrid French and Japanese inspired dish. So what I've done for the broth itself is a process which, unfortunately, it's very long, so I can't go through all the processes, but I did a pressure-cooked beef stock here. So instead of combining the traditional dashi stock, I'm using some of the same ingredients, but looking at this from the traditional, classical French point of view, but making the stock in a kind of more modernist type of way. So in this stock and in the recipes you have, I just took a whole oxtails here and ground them up using a large die on a grinder. So just essentially took the whole oxtail and fed it through a grinder using the largest die. And what I'm doing there is actually taking the meat and bone and grinding that together to create the maximum amount of surface area. So in traditional stock making, and when we have an open top, traditional French stock, we usually use large pieces of meat, large pieces of bone, and large pieces of mirepoix. But because I'm going to pressure cook this stock, what I want to do is create the maximum amount of surface area that I possibly can for the extraction. For the extraction of flavor, for the extraction of the gelatin. So instead of using large pieces, I actually want to break this down mechanically as fine as I can. So feeding the whole oxtail through, so meat and bone together, so I get this ground meat and bone meal. Use that ground kind of beef and brown that off really, really deep brown there. Remove that from the pan, and have the fawn that's built up there. I've sauteed very thinly sliced onions, garlic, and ginger, and deglaze that with sake and mirin. And again, what's different from this modern technique versus the traditional, the classical, is when we have these large pots of stock that we're simmering for several hours, we cut the pieces of vegetables quite large because through the process of heating, they're going to agitate. And as they agitate, they're going to start to break down. As they break down, they're going to fall apart, and they're going to put the particles, all that particulate is going to go into our stock and make the stock cloudy. But what's different in pressure cooking is that through the process of extraction, we actually don't have any agitation that's occurring inside of the pressure cooker. So I have the ground meat and the very thinly sliced vegetables all together in one browned off kind of meal, and then covering that with water and pressure cooking that for an hour and a half. So what's happening in the pressure cooking process is that instead of having a traditional pot where we're simmering it, that's relying on heat and time and agitation to extract the flavor, we're actually using heat and pressure to actually essentially rip the flavor out of the whole material inside, and the heat just to extract that. But inside we don't have any reactive flavors. We're not creating any Maillard reactions or having any kind of reactions inside of the pot. So we do all the browning ahead, cover that with water, and use the pressure cooker to actually extract this out. So it's very efficient in time, and it's very efficient in process in that we're going to get the most out of this expensive product. So it means that, yes, when I first say I would take a whole oxtail and grind it up, it sounds like, well, that sounds expensive, and to go through all that, use that cut like that just to make stock. But what it means is because I'm creating this maximum amount of surface area, I don't need as much of the actual meat and bone to get much more flavor out of it than I would in a traditional stock. So when we have large pieces and we're simmering them in a traditional stock, we're only really extracting what's on the outside. It's very difficult for us to get what's in the core of the product out into the stock. And that's why we cook things for a very long period of time. And because we're cooking it for a long period of time, we lose a lot of very volatile flavors, very volatile aroma compounds. And every time we're looking at this technique, the students say, what's the first thing that you notice when you walk into a kitchen and they're making stock? You walk into a kitchen and someone's making stock, it's the first thing that you notice. The smell, right, the aroma. So all of that aroma that's coming out, these are all the very most kind of volatile aroma compounds that are actually coming off into the air instead of staying inside of our stock. So by pressure cooking, what we're doing is we're actually containing all of the aromas, all of the flavors in there, being very efficient in the way that we extract. In the process of pressure cooking, we're sealing the lid. We're bringing that up to full pressure, to about 15 psi. And once we bring it up, we just keep it on a very low heat. Just get this on a very low heat for about an hour and a half. So this isn't an overnight process. This isn't a 12 or 24-hour cook time for beef stock. We get it up, pull everything out. So you have an equal amount of force that's exerting up as it's coming down, and it's going from the side, and in every direction we have an equal amount of force. And because inside the pressure cooker it's sealed, what we're doing is we're actually lowering the atmospheric pressure inside the pressure cooking. We're creating, in effect, our own atmosphere where inside the pressure the laws of physics do not apply inside as they do on our planet inside the pressure cooker. So where normally the water boiling here is boiling at 212 degrees, and that's where it stops. And generally, whenever boiling a meat stock, we're simply simmering it gently so that we don't over-agitate and break up all of the material in there. So we will generally be at about 180 degrees. But because we've lowered the atmospheric pressure inside the pressure cooker, we can actually bring it up to about 225 degrees. So we have a very, very hot core on the inside of the pressure cooker. But the kind of image is inside that it must be boiling away in there at such a high temperature. But actually, if you could see inside the pressure cooker while it's cooking, it would be perfectly still. Because as the water is boiling and then there's evaporation is occurring, it's cooling out the surface, we have this boiling, simmering action. And in the traditional stock, that's breaking up our vegetables and breaking up the meat, causing it to be cloudy, causing it to break down. But in a pressure cooker, since we have the same amount of force going down as it's coming up, it's a total stalemate inside. So all of the force that's being generated is actually pulling and put into extraction rather than agitation. So where traditional stock is agitating, pressure cooker is extracting. So we have very, very efficient extraction here. So what I've done is I've pressure cooked that for an hour and a half and let that cool down, let it the pressure come down naturally. And one of the things that's very important in pressure cooking is that you allow it to cool all the way down to room temperature. Because you're starting at 230, 225 degrees, you've got to pass all the way through 212 and down to 180 to when it's going to stop to boil. If you open it too soon, after the pressure allows you to take the top off, you open it up and all of a sudden you break that atmosphere and it'll start to boil. And that's why a lot of people have the impression that inside a pressure cooker there's somehow movement because they open it too soon and all of a sudden it just comes to a boil. And when it does, it starts to take the fat from the stock and emulsify it. And that's one of the great things is when you've made a really properly cooked pressure cooked stock, you take the top off and all the fat is a perfect layer on the top and all of the broth is sitting underneath that. You taste the material, you look at a very thin sliced carrot, for example, and it's perfectly intact. Taste it and there's no flavor in it. Or you put it between your two fingers and it just turns into really soft puree. So after that's done, depressurized, taking the top off of that, strained that, left a little bit of the fat in there as a kind of coating mouthfeel because we have both water-soluble and fat-soluble flavor compounds in there. So in sauteing it, we've extracted all the fat-soluble compounds into the fat, and then all the water-soluble compounds are in the liquid. So when you taste it, you're going to have a little bit of the fat and a little bit of the liquid. So to that, same as chef, I wanted to use this the soup base, but I want to use it in a slightly different way than the traditional context. So this soup base that chef was using, as you see, he's using different ratios for different things. So there's quite a few different dishes that can be created off of this base. So depending on how you dilute that. So because I already had a dilution that was the stock, I've added some of this the concentrated base for the umami, because we have kombu in there, we have the bonito extraction in there. This is a very, very high glutamate liquid, so very, very high in the amino acids, ribonucleotides for the umami, the glutamates in there. And also I've added a clear type of soy sauce that's becoming very popular in the US, also called shiro shoyu, which means white soy sauce. And traditionally in Japanese cooking, chefs use shiro shoyu, white soy, when they're making a clear broth. So if they have a broth that they want to keep clear, it's called usumashi. Usually have a clear stock. So they have this extraction that they've made, and they want to keep the clarity of the extraction. So instead of putting soy sauce in there, which is going to make it dark, they add I'll show you the clarity. They add this to keep the kind of clarity, the ability to translucent look of the stock. So I've added a small amount of this because it's really kind of almost like liquid salt and liquid umami. hold it up and it seems dark, but if you look in the light, it's quite clear. So I'm using these two different products to kind of get the umami side of it. So taking something from a traditional French dish and adding these kind of Japanese flavors to it. Okay, so to assemble a dish, we're going to cook the udon noodles. And I've heated up some of the broth here. And then keeping with the traditional French pot au feu, I've used a tougher cut of meat. This is a beef short rib here, but I've cooked this for sous vide at 56 degrees, 56 C. I've cooked this actually for 72 hours. And this is kind of on the extreme end of sous vide cooking in terms of time and temperature. So very, very low temperature for an extended period of time. So essentially what this is it's a braised piece of meat, but it's still being served rare. So it's kind of braised rare, which in any other cooking technique you wouldn't be able to kind of create both this texture with having something that's rare all the way through. So I've taken the short rib here, seasoned it with salt and pepper on both sides, and some Japanese spice. Seared that, cooled it, vacuum sealed that, and put that here for 72 hours. It's kind of for fun. Something that long. Not exactly casual. That. What we have is something that eats like a rare piece of meat. Eats like a braise, but it's a rare piece of meat. Here, and you'll taste this outside when we're finished. And you can see that there's no kind of gradation of seared and gray and rare on the inside. It's through the sous vide cooking method. We actually have to have the same amount of cooking all the way through. And I have the broth here, which is broth. So I'm just really going to moisten these, and it's going to be quite rich. And then I have all of my pot au feu vegetables here, which I've cooked individually. And then for convenience for service, I've cooked each one individually. And then chilled them. And then for service, I would put these all backpack them lightly. And then I have one assembly. Instead of having to take all these individual vegetables all the way in, put them together here. So in here I have the napa cabbage and its stem, kabu, turnips, Japanese white turnips, some carrots, baby bok choy, and its stem. And those are kind of making up our traditional rustic kind of tofu style vegetables. And these here are Tokyo negi, which is like a large kind of scallion. Japanese, very long, almost like halfway between a scallion and a leek, that have been charred. So just took the whole scallions, charred them, cooled them, and sliced them so we can get some kind of, because all these are just blanched, so we can get some kind of more Maillard flavors into the dish, the caramelization. And these are the blanched tops of the turnips. Again, trying to really stay true to, even though it's a very more refined dish, trying to stay true to the countryside way of cooking. So utilization of all of the products, not letting anything go to waste. So we're using the stems of vegetables, we're using the leaves of vegetables in the assembly of this. Again, like the chef was using, we have the grated daikon. Oh, sorry, grated ginger. So oftentimes the pot of food in France is served with mustard for a little bit of heat. So using a little bit of ginger, we could use wasabi here to get a little bit of that kind of fresh kind of heat to it. Also a little bit of the togarashi, Japanese spices. And this is very thin sliced scallion. Some Washington cheesecloth, and dried. Sesame seeds. And then julienne nori, julienne seaweed. This is our Japanese udon noodle pot food.